recording studio. This is the Oklahoma State University's Archives Live. Hey folks, my name is Olivia Turner, and today with me is David Peters, the head archivist over at the OSU Libraries. Today, and today only, y'all can consider us the disc jockeys for this month's live episode. David, how are you doing today?
Doing great. Glad to be with you again.
Thank you. I'm glad to be with you as well. So, modern technology today allows us to record this live session so our audience can see and hear us in clear quality. But, as you all know, it wasn't always like that. Before the internet was television, and before television was radio. And radio has transformed Oklahoma State in so many ways by providing fresh content for faculty and students, as well as providing sports updates for anxious Tigers and Cowboys fans. But David, how did OAMC come about the idea to develop radio?
So radio was in its infancy. Beginning in the 20s, radio stations began popping up all over the nation, all right? And OAMC at the time felt that they needed to be a part of that, and so they tried to get a station. They tried to bring a station to campus, and they tried to work with other land-grant colleges to have all of them attract stations for fulfilling their land-grant mission. We were unsuccessful at that, but they did develop a smaller, lower wattage station, mostly for students to work on and to experiment with the use of radio. But fairly quickly, by the mid to late 20s, we had developed a relationship which is now called KVOO. VOO stands for Voice of Oklahoma. But we had, the station had moved to Tulsa, and we had more or less a telephone wire from our campus to the station. And so we had worked with them then to allow us to broadcast certain things live from here. It went by wire to Tulsa, and then they could broadcast it. And so we worked with KVOO for a number of years. They worked with our College of Agriculture. They worked with our School of Home Economics. And they also began some of our first broadcasts of events. And we can talk about more of that later. But radio kind of discovered us. And so we hopped on fairly quickly because it was exciting and new, and it was an adventure.
That's a great way to put it. What was the significance of developing a radio station for OSU?
So initially, President Knapp, Bradford Knapp, realized that radio could be used to share information, to extend all kinds of information out to the public. And at the time, over 60% of occupants of the state of Oklahoma, citizens, lived in rural areas. And many of these rural areas didn't have electricity, and it was difficult for them to go into like county extension agent offices. But if a radio program could provide that same content on crop production, livestock, food and health safety, child rearing, whatever it was that our extension services had not only provided by paper or by presentations, now they could reach thousands of people by radio. And so Knapp really began to explore how to utilize radio by the campus as an extension tool.
Okay. So for those of you who are just now joining and you have absolutely no idea what is going on, this is the Oklahoma State University's Archives Live. My name is Olivia Turner, this is David Peters, and we are today talking about radio. I do have a quick question for the audience, and that is, what is the first radio station you guys remember? Mine was 103.7 in Dallas, and I can't really remember what all it broadcast, but I do remember it played in my dentist's office, and I remember the Delilah Show, which is a bit of a throwback for anybody else who also used to listen to that. David, what about you?
I used to listen to WLS in Chicago. Growing up, that was a major station. It hit all of the Midwest, northern Midwest, and it carried popular music, which I really loved. So that was in the late 60s.
Awesome. So bringing it back to OSU, what did the radio content used to look like?
So initially we had like an hour that we would get contracted from KVOO, and we would have a series of lectures. Usually these were 5 to 10 minute lectures. So it's fairly dry. I mean, this is, you know, they would rotate through the faculty. They'd come up with topics, and then they'd more or less read their lecture over the air. But very quickly they began realizing they would able to keep the audience if they included other things in it. And so they began having musical interludes. They would have string quartets play maybe between several of the lectures, or they'd have a vocal music, a choir do some performance. And these were all OSU students or OSU OAMC faculty and staff. But they tried to begin including a little entertainment to kind of break down the monotony of the lectures. The lectures were important information, but you had to retain the audience somehow. And so they began including more entertainment. And by the late 20s, not only had we hardwired into a campus kind of studio, but they had wired over to the athletic area. And so the gymnasium, it's now the School of Architecture, and the Lewis Field, which is now Boone Pickens Stadium, had wire that ran to them. So they began broadcasting sports events.
Okay.
So that's and that was very popular through the 30s and into the 40s. Into the 40s, they began to develop even additional programming. They had an Aunt Aggie show. It was a part of the presentation. They were up to 2 days a week, and then many of their programs are now being copied, and then they would be broadcast on other stations too and distributed that way. So they were reaching a much larger audience beginning in the 40s and the 50s.
All right. How could students listen to radio if they needed to?
So early on in the 20s, there were very few radios out there, and most radios were battery operated. But by the 30s, we had several residence halls on campus, and so if you lived in a residence hall, just like students now might collect around a TV for a football game or something, they would collect around a radio console and listen to the programming over the radio. And it was at the time it was considered almost miraculous that they could get this information from all over. I mean, radio stations we could receive from quite a few places, and so, but students would gather around these console radios. As radios became cheaper and more common, then they began purchasing them. They could listen to them in their rooms. And a lot of students lived at home. Of course, the family would have a radio. The number of radios just exploded in the United States. And it went from like 15 to 20% of the population in the 20s who had a radio to I think over 80% of the population in the 40s and 50s that had radio. So it just exploded. And then of course by the 40s and 50s, then you begin seeing television.
Absolutely. That is so cool. So what were the first programs that were really aired over at OAMC? I remember you talking a little bit about Aunt Aggie.
Aunt Aggie. So they had these lectures, and they had the athletic events. But then Aunt Aggie, and it was common for a number of radio stations. There was an Aunt Susie out of OU. We had an Aunt Aggie here, but they were little plays really that had some kind of moral or some kind of instructional aspect to them. But they really took kind of more production. It wasn't just someone reading a speech. You had now people engaged in a conversation, and so they had quote radio actors. We had it was called the Prairie Radio group, I think, but these were students and staff who participated in some of these kind of skits. And so they really began to develop the programming by the 40s into the 50s and 60s, and people would play characters to kind of tell the story.
That is so cool. Radio is something that I am so passionate about. I remember growing up and really loving to listen to disc jockeys in the morning and just seeing how they interacted with the audience and what funny skits they'd have. But I kind of understand that probably wasn't the preference for a lot of people when radio was first developing. So it's really cool to see how people, how radio has changed and how people like to listen to it now. Because, media has developed and things like podcasts, we're sitting right in front of a podcast studio right now, has really taken over, and people can really talk about anything and everything under the sun and really get a potential audience going. But what I really want to know is, when you guys listen to radio, what do you listen to? Do you like to listen to music? Do you like to listen to talk radio? Do you like to listen to the news? Or do you just forgo radio at all and just listen to podcasts? Comment down below and we'd love to see what you have to say. Also, if you have any questions or comments about Oklahoma State in general, feel free to comment that as well. We love to hear what everyone has to say, and we look forward to seeing what you have to say. While you guys do that, I took the opportunity to take a tour of the KOSU radio station right here in the journalism building. So you all are going to come with me and we're going to take a quick look. Hey folks, you're currently here with me on the 3rd floor of the Paul Miller Journalism Building. The great part about the journalism building is that it has so many extracurricular activities for students, like the O'Collie, to the podcast booth, to even being right here in the KOSU radio station. So you're going to come with me and we're going to take a quick look. KOSU has been part of the OAMC campus since 1955, and it was the third permanent FM radio station in Oklahoma. Growing from a small-town broadcast station covering only the OAMC campus, KOSU now reaches thousands of listeners per week, bringing NPR news content and the spy to Oklahoma's airwaves. This is the recording room. I was really fortunate enough to be able to use this for the past 2 years to record my own radio show. And in order to do that, I would sit in front of the computer and the microphone, slap on some headphones, and mess with the control board, and push a fader until it was the perfect volume for me. Thanks for coming with me to get a quick look of the station. Thanks to KOSU for letting us look around. Don't forget to visit kosu.org and go Pokes. So I would like to give a special thanks to KOSU and Jenny Mae Harms for allowing us to take a tour in the facility. It was so much fun. And as we were touring, I actually was able to develop a couple more questions about KOSU in general. So David, has KOSU always been in the journalism building?
Yes. So this building originally was called the Science Building, built about 1918, 1919. But in 1958, it was designated as the Communications Building. And that's also about the same time a school of communications begins to form. And when KOSU then really went on air regularly for the first time in 1958-59, they were located in this building.
Awesome. So whenever Jenny Mae was taking us around and she was showing us this really cool kind of secret room, and in the secret room, there was like this column in this brick, and she kind of described it as what used to be the front of the building. Do you know anything about that?
That used to be the front of the building. And so for buildings like Morrill Hall and the Architecture Building, which was built at the same time as the building we're in now, columns were very popular. And that was kind of before the Bennett era and our kind of modified Georgian architecture style that we have now. By the time this building was renovated and called the Paul Miller Building, I think it was probably mid-70s, the style of buildings had changed, the columns weren't popular anymore, and it really didn't fit into the rest of the decor. And so they tried to blend the addition, which was the Paul Miller Building now, trying to blend that into construction that was going on at the time, so it blends more in with like the Student Union and other buildings. And so that's when the columns were just kind of covered up, and so they're stuck there because the new addition went on to the east side of the building, and so they're kind of between the old front of the building and the addition. And there really wasn't anything else they could do with that space. So it's kind of like a big closet, I think. It's been a while since I've been in there, but I think there's 4 columns.
When we went in, I could only see one, and I could only see the brick because there was quite a bit of other things in the closet. But I will say, it felt pretty cool to be in there. I touched the column. I will say, I touched the column and I felt like I was a part of history, which was pretty cool. So we actually have a couple questions from our viewers.
Okay.
Bonnie wants to know, are there any recordings of the early radio programs in the archives?
Well, thanks for that question, Bonnie. Regretfully, no, we don't have recordings from early broadcasts. There were some things like with when the broadcasts were being distributed to other stations, those recordings are probably out there somewhere. We just don't have it in the archives. But it's a good question. We need to follow up on where those recordings might be.
That would be so cool if we were able to stumble upon some. Anthony wants to know what studio we are in right now.
I don't know. It's
So Anthony, to answer your question, we are currently in the OkState TV studio. So students are able to record like a daily news show, I believe. And then we also are sitting in front of a podcast studio that is also shared with the same studio that OkState TV is used in. It's a really cool studio. I definitely suggest that all students who are in the SMSC school or even just in OSU come check it out if they can. William wants to know, if KOSU was the third permanent station, what was the first for FM radio broadcasts?
in Oklahoma.
Yes.
I'm not sure of that either. That's off campus. That's not really my area of expertise. But we can find out who the other two were. The other challenge they had when KOSU was finally approved, we also were running KVRO, for people familiar with KVRO radio. That stood for campus with a K, Varsity Radio Organization. And so it was a group of staff and students who were really kind of running that part of the station. They used the same facilities as KOSU. And Oklahoma State University continued to support KVRO for a number of years, and there's still kind of a symbiotic relationship between the two. But those were the two stations, but KVRO had to kind of spin off when KOSU was approved as an FM station. But we'll find out for William what the other two stations were, but I'm sure we were the third one was the best.
Yeah, absolutely. I will agree with that.
It was the charm.
It was the charm. So how does radio differ from then to what we have now?
So then it covers a long period of time. So even then, there's a series of changes. I mean, I think back to in 1915, there was a smokestack on the power station. It was pretty high, and they ran a wire from the top of that stack to what was the engineering building at the time. I think it was, now we call it Gunderson. But that was to receive electromagnetic signals, radio waves. And so it was very primitive. That's kind of their antenna. And they've got a few people, mostly students. They form a radio club. And so it starts as this really small unit. And it grew out of electrical engineering. Engineering was actively involved with the development of radio, and physics was involved with radio. You got all kinds of issues there academically, but they are the first people to be involved with radio, and they're concerned with both transmitting signals and receiving signals. And so they're concerned with the technology of it. Over time, though, as people begin looking at programming and how to utilize that, that's where other students and other people get involved, at least on our campus, with programming and ideas for how to take advantage of this way. I mean, at the time, they just thought it was amazing that you could send a signal out and it would radiate in all directions. You can kind of focus it, but it would radiate out. And in the past, you were dependent upon a wire to carry information, or a horse on the Pony Express, or whatever it was. You had very limited ability to communicate. And so this was just an amazing opportunity to share information. So as the technology grew, because initially, I mean, they were having trouble with the signals. Signals would bleed over onto other signals. So you had stations had different signals, but they were competing with each other. And so the receivers were having trouble picking up. Anyway, I'm getting in the bushes here, but it was kind of the Old West. And so as they fine-tuned the technology and they began fine-tuning the programming, it became much more elaborate, much more sophisticated. And then you had people not only from the technical side, but you had people coming in, especially in ag and in human sciences, utilizing their coursework to share information regarding extension. But then you start getting theater and music people involved from the arts who want to share their specialties that now can be broadcast over radio. And so programming just takes off. And we see today the plethora of programming options that are available. But there's that transition over time as both the technology and programming improves. And so it's been a wonderful ride. And I think radio still has a long life left in it.
There's a lot of potential that is just waiting to be discovered. How has radio impacted sports, if at all?
So like I said, KVOO agreed to kind of hardwire into the gymnasium and the stadium fairly early on because they realized there was demand for listeners for sporting events. And in the old days, I mean, especially wrestling was very popular, but basketball and football also. It was a little harder for baseball, but eventually baseball was included. And so I think it's not like radio kept people from attending. It just allowed people in other areas who are a great distance from Stillwater to now participate, to feel like they were a part of the crowd. Because at the time it was difficult to travel here to attend events. So I think it added to the popularity of sports, and sports added to the popularity of radio. I mean, they both were very helpful to each other. And the university was very happy that they were able to create that bond with KVOO, and eventually, contracts changed and other broadcasters got involved. But it really was a way of sharing the story about what was going on athletically on our campus with tens of thousands of people. So
KOSU, it was fairly popular back then. So was really the Ocali. So a lot of people also turned to newspaper for news. This is something I just want to know. Do we ever know if there was some sort of rivalry between the two in terms of getting news out and stuff like that?
So initially, they really had two different audiences. Initially, the Ocali in the old days came out once a week. It was the Orange and Black was the name of the publication, but it came out once a week. Well, radio, they had a radio program every day, But remember, the O'Colly is really talking about news, and radio is more talking about these lectures, this informational presentation. The O'Colly really can't perform plays or have musicals, and so they really were dealing with different audiences. And so there was really, actually, they complemented each fairly well. And there would be advertisements in the student newspaper for radio programming that was coming up. In fact, there was a little column that talked about what stations were playing what programs at which times. And so really they complemented each other. And I think part of that too, as this School of Communications grew, they wanted to make sure that they were cooperating with each other and being partners rather than competing. But usually they had different audiences and different kind of time frames. And so they worked well together.
We love to hear that. So do we know if there were any OAMC or OSU students who went on to become radio entertainers?
So there were local celebrities, I guess, who came out of radio here. Leon Matthews was a local celebrity. Bill Platt did play-by-play for Cowboy Sports for a number of years on the radio. Jimmy Baker, who I think was here in the 40s, maybe early 50s, who was involved with radio here, went on and worked for ABC for a number of years, won several Emmys. And so he's probably the one who made the biggest dent nationally through his experience starting with radio. He was also just an entertainer. He had a big band. He had a variety of things going for him. But he was actually involved with radio here and then went on into broadcasting in Hollywood.
Okay. Another member of our audience wants to know, were there any classes that taught the technology behind radio?
Excellent question. Yes, there were. There was a gentleman named James Kazitsky, I believe, and he came in the early 20s, and he developed the first really broadcast unit on campus, and he was the first to offer classes. They were in electrical engineering classes, and they were so popular that eventually he offered one for non-electrical engineering majors. There were people who didn't want to be electrical engineering majors, but they were interested in radio. And so he started with that first 2 classes, one for those interested in that topic as a career, and those just interested in it. Then eventually commerce, the School of Commerce got involved. They saw the business aspect to it and the possibilities there. Just like journalism kind of grew out of English as a course offering, the whole production side of it grew out of commerce and working with some of the arts folks. And so the classes kind of developed and changed over times and were sponsored by different groups over time, different departments. But there were courses for students to take. But it wasn't until the 50s where you really kind of had a major in communications that kind of put all of it together.
Okay, that's really interesting. You know, David, this whole segment and learning about the impact of radio has been so cool to hear about. Is there anything else you wanted to include before we sign off for the evening?
I think it's difficult for us now to understand the impact of radio, but for people living, especially out in rural areas, remote rural areas, oftentimes, miles from their neighbors, a great distance from the local town. Now for them to be able to kind of interact by listening to programming coming in, it really kind of started bringing people together in ways. And so, we've heard stories about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his broadcast over radio, where families would gather around the radio. He'd reassure them during the Depression. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, it was just a way of feeling like they were a part of something bigger than just themselves, and they weren't alone out there. And I think that impact was just incredible for a lot of people, and brought people together. Before they had electrical lines out to their homes, they had battery-operated radios, and that's how they communicated and listened to what was going on in the world.
Awesome. This has been such an amazing Archives Live, because it has been so interesting to learn about the impact of radio and how it's different from when it first developed. I know for one, I'm going to be extremely excited to go home tonight and listen to the radio, and I hope the same could be said for you all as well. If you want to learn more about the Oklahoma State University's archives, visit archives.library.okstate.edu. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to DM us on Facebook at Oklahoma State University's Archives. Also, if you're not following us, feel free to do that as well. David, Thank you so much for meeting with me today, and thank you to our audience for tuning in. As always, go Pokes!